Hello and welcome to this presentation on Afternoons by Philip Larkin. As normal in these videos, we'll cover the 3 assessment objectives. You can see the grade criteria in front of you. When it says level 5, think that's probably around about a grade 7 or upwards. Level 3 would be your pass grade, and then level 1 would be your basic knowledge. So we have AO1, understand what the poem's about, AO2, language, form and structure, and AO3, the context. Let's learn a little bit about Larkin himself then.
Larkin is famous for his fear of death. He's also famous for his fear of life. But when I first read Larkin, it wasn't the fear of extinction that rang a bell. I was still young enough to think that bells like that only rang for other people. It was recognition of a different sort. Familiarity, not so much with the feelings he was talking about, as the places. There were the provinces, for a start, where nothing ever happened. Libraries, where I'd spent half my life. Churches, where I'd spent the other. Until I read Larkin, and in particular that poem, I'd never imagined such experiences, or non-experiences, could be the stuff of poetry. But then, nor had Larkin. When he first started writing poetry, and before he learned the sound of his own voice, Larkin wrote like Auden. Then, when he got to university, it was Yeats. Finally, he discovered Hardy, whom he liked, he said, because he taught him he didn't have to jack himself up into poetry. It could be ordinary and about ordinary things. And this suited Larkin because his life had always been ordinary. His childhood he characterised as a forgotten boredom. His father was the city treasurer of Coventry, and they don't seem to have got on.
As you can see then, Larkin has become famous because he writes about everyday life. This is unusual. Most poets tend to think, oh, I need to find the best in life to explain. Larkin studied the beauty of the everyday.
Larkin's mother, Eva, was widowed in 1948. He was always a dutiful, loving son.
He is dedicated to her and can't ever not be, but there is a tremendous ambiguity about it. It's a lifelong duty.
Did you like the photographs? I think I might get myself an enlargement. Is there anyone you like? Perhaps you think they're awful. I like number 6 very much, though. It shows you as the dear old creature you are.
There's a lovely one he took from an upstairs bedroom window, where he's obviously posed her, knowing the effect, standing in the middle of the lawn, and then behind her there's a wall, and behind her there's a field. And there she is standing, this elderly woman, looking up at the photograph being taken of her. It has tremendous pathos and also...
As you can see then, Larkin wasn't just a poet but a photographer as well. In many ways you could see his poems as photographs of everyday life, just placed into words. Larkin is a poet whose eyes appeared always on the future, and perhaps even his own death. The women in his life were ones he supported and felt a duty to protect. Perhaps the mothers in the poem are symbolic of what he thought would happen to the human race. Some facts then about Philip Larkin to hit AO3 context. Philip Larkin was a significant 20th century poet whose work is characterised by detailed observations of everyday life and relationships. He was a gifted photographer as well as a poet. He is famous for celebrating the ordinary by writing about things not usually considered suitable or important enough to be the subject of poetry. Larkin himself did not marry, had no children, and never went abroad. He worked as a university librarian at Hull University for over 30 years. He tried to join the war, but failed the medical exam due to his eyesight, which left him then in the library looking outwards at other people's lives, moving on and rolling by. To study Larkin, then, we need to understand what life was like in the 1960s when he was written. So this is about 12 years after the war. So the war itself, the Second World War, will be very much in everyone's memory. Gender roles at this time were a lot more stereotypical. Women's job was to stay at home and cook, whilst the men were obligated to go and work to feed their family. The rundown housing of the war began to be replaced by modern housing that was full of green space. All the bomb sites, all the old buildings that just about survived the war was slowly but surely disappearing, making way for more modern buildings. Technology was beginning to improve and the television was becoming much more commonplace in every home, something that perhaps Larkin disagreed with, as people focused more on the television and less on their interactions with others. The British economy was also beginning to recover after the war era, and much of the population saw it as a new beginning, an era of lasting peace. Philip Larkin's poem, then, Afternoons, read by the poet himself.
Afternoons. Summer is fading. The leaves fall in ones and twos from trees bordering the new recreation ground. In the hollows of afternoons, young mothers assemble at swing and sandpit, setting free their children. Behind them, at intervals, stand husbands in skilled trades, an estate full of washing, and the albums lettered Our Wedding lying near the television. Before them, the wind is ruining their courting places, that are still courting places, but the lovers are all in school, and their children, so intent on finding more unripe acorns, expect to be taken home. Their beauty has thickened. Something is pushing them to the side of their own lives.
As normal, we're now going to look at the three parts of the poem, the beginning, the middle and the end. You're going to see notes appear round the outside. The ones in black are our structural notes, and I think the ones in white or a different colour are the ones linked to language. The title itself then suggests the end of a day, or the end of a season, or indeed the end of a life. Larkin hints that this is the beginning of the end, which gives the poem a melancholic or sad or dystopian feel. The plural suggests that life is monotonous and dull. It's not one afternoon, it's every afternoon. Larkin goes on to say that summer is fading. Is this fatalistic? Is he suggesting the best of life is already behind us? Does the colon turn this line into a factual statement? Larkin makes a social comment as if the boom that was promised after the war is somehow hollow and empty. Summer could also be the prime of life, yet this is seen to be dull. The leaves falling in ones and twos suggest a gradual decline, one that's almost unnoticeable, as if the social decay is unstoppable, but hardly noticed. He describes a new recreation ground, where he contrasts the old with the new. The old rec ground has been replaced by something new, implying the old world Larkin knew as he grew up is being replaced by something more shallow and meaningless. He might have been thinking about the houses that used to be on this recreation ground, ones that had been there and withstood the whole war, now being replaced by these sort of concrete structures that have been rushed to build to house the growing population of Britain at the time. This suggests a sense of control, as even the play is now controlled. The idea of the children not being able to run around the streets freely, but now having a place to go to where they have to play in. The word hollow suggests a sense of emptiness, loneliness and dissatisfaction. And then we have this first reference to the mothers. These mothers are anonymous. We don't know who they are, they have no names. They seem to be trapped in a routine, trapped in the routine of their daily lives, trapped in their typical domesticated life, as if they are robots rather than people following a set of instructions. The females here are simply known for being mothers, perhaps trapped in their role as a mother rather than being seen as a human being. The enjambment here makes the poem seem relentless and never-ending. Larkin continually chops lines as if this poem is going to go on and on and on. Perhaps it's the point of view of the adults in the poem, as if the life they have in front of them is never-ending, a never-ending life of boredom. We then have this reference to setting free their children. The freedom of the playground represents the freedom they'll eventually seek from their parents. Yet they are restricted to the confines of the sandpit. They're allowed to be free, but only in a certain area. The middle of the poem then, or as the poem develops. We then take a glance behind these mothers. The preposition behind implies the powerful role of women in the new world, as Larkin could foreshadow the role that women will take. The husbands are being left behind by these growing, powerful mothers. Notice these mothers then set apart from their husbands. They're in almost different stanzas. The men do not gather together, imply a criticism of the male role in society. The word skilled may be ironic, as the business of parenting is left to the mothers. They're in skilled trades, but seem to be almost powerless or motionless in the background. We then have this brief mention of a state full of washing. This suggests a working class society, Larkin's own background. The image here is of piles of washing. The domestic workload is never ending. Perhaps at this point Larkin is picturing his own childhood with his mother, one that, as we saw from the clip, he clearly appreciated as he supported his mother in her later years. We can see the wedding album is lying. The wedding album is discarded and forgotten, as if thrown on the floor. The enjambment here suggests the role of marriage in society is no longer relevant or true. The double meaning, perhaps, of the word lying. The lines in, or the pictures in the wedding album are lying to us, suggesting this perfect existence, which actually isn't the case in real life. I think it's important this wedding album is lying near the television. It's as if the TV overshadows their lives. This stereotypes the working class society, but also the power of the media in changing how we think. We've got a link to the word wind here, which is an example of pathetic fallacy, where the weather indicates a mood or the future. The wind is normally symbolic of change or progress. Then you can look at the next line. Is ruining their courting places, as if the once romantic young love is being slowly torn apart by the wind. Now, the middle of the poem. The cyclical nature of life is hinted by the repetition of courting places at the beginning of this stanza and at the end of the last. The lovers are no longer parents, but also children of the parents, perhaps describing love as teenage and immature and not present in adult life. We then have a part in brackets here, but the lovers are all still in school. The implication being that young love is more exciting or satisfying. Or is it that this represents the cycle of life starting again, as the children begin the monotonous cycle once more? They're beginning to grow, bond, marry, and then have kids of their own. We have this particular interesting phrase, unripe acorns. Does unripe simply mean not ready for love? Perhaps Larkin has been critical of youth here, as he watches them in this playground, playing rather than taking life seriously. The woman's role is second to the children. These children expect to be taken home. The children are not in charge of their own lives. The mothers are not in charge of their own lives. They have a role to fulfill. The children expect to be taken home by these servants or mothers just waiting at the sidelines. You've then got this wonderful phrase, their beauty has thickened. But whose beauty has thickened? Is it the parents or the mothers? Is it the children? Has having children aged the parents, or is this a comment on the children themselves? Is the idea of a family more appealing than the reality of family life? Has purity been corrupted in some way? Certainly it suggests something that was once perfect is now slowly but surely aging and perhaps dying. It then has this obscure something. What is the something that stops them from living the life they should? This creates, once more, a regretful and fatalistic tone. Something is deliberately vague and open to interpretation. Could it be the government, God, or the women's own ambitions or dreams that is holding them back? We're left to decide that for ourselves. The end stop line here suggests finality. The mundane everyday life is inescapable. Our fate is sealed. Our destiny is to die and become thick as our beauty or innocence fades. Let's unpick the poem then to its basic ingredients. Who is it about? We have Philip Larkin sitting in a playground describing the loves of the working class and the people he sees there. What is the poem about? Larkin describes mothers in the playground before going on to hint at their home lives before finally looking at the future. The tone here starts observational, then becomes melancholic. Why was it written? Larkin saw the life these mothers live as an inescapable and inevitable cage from which they cannot escape. Yet there isn't the sense that he wants things to change. We now go on to use 3 quotes with exclamations around the outside, which are the key quotes for this poem. This is quote number 1. Then we move on to quote number 2. And quote number 3. For each of these quotes, please pause the video to make notes in your revision books. As normal, we're now going to go on to exam technique, and today we're going to focus particularly on explaining the effects of language. In your previous learning, you would have been taught many different ways to tackle a quote. In Year 7, for example, you might have covered PE paragraphs, point, evidence, explain. Your teacher might have mentioned petal paragraphs, making a point, then using evidence, naming the technique used, analysing the evidence you've given, and then linking back to the question set. Or perhaps you've been taught a set of steps. 9 steps are featured perhaps in a video, one of my other videos, going into much more depth in terms of how you might analyse a quote and explain its meaning linked to context. All of these ways, whichever one you've learned, have one key skill in common: explaining a quote effectively. This is a fundamental key skill in this English GCSE test. You can see on the mark scheme here, the word effects appears at the bottom level as well as the top. The more you explain effects and the more specific you are in the effects created, the higher the grade then goes. Let's think about the exact wording used by the exam board then. We've got the word analysis being used. For the level 3 and the level 5 need to use analysis. Analysis means to zoom in on a particular word of the text and explain why this exact word was chosen. If you've got a quote of, let's say, 5 words long, if you were to analyse it, you'd pick one of the 5 words to look at more closely. It also asks you, the exam mark scheme asks you to look at effects created. This is how a language choice or technique makes you think of a particular detail about the person, theme, or situation described. So this makes me think about, this suggests to us, this challenges me to understand, are all sentence starters that suggest that you're going to explain the effect created. Here is an example then, one of the key lines from the poem. Our wedding lying, enjambment used there, near the television. Our first answer then is our grade 2. This quote shows the wedding album is on the floor and makes us think the wedding is not important. This doesn't explain effects, it simply says what the line tells us. It's got links to reader, makes us think, but it's one sentence long and so not at all developed. Our second example clearly is a bit more detailed. The quote, "Our wedding lying near the television," suggests to us that love is being discarded because the couple are too busy watching TV rather than caring about each other. This makes the reader think that ideas like love are being left behind. This is a bit better, it's about a grade 4. It's beginning to look at what the quote is suggesting to us, the reader, and it does explain the answer, clearly using the word because here. It is explaining its meaning, and then begins to think about, well, what's that quote actually making us think about? I mean, this person has clearly explained it by saying, this makes the reader think that, and then answered it for this quote. 2-sentence long answer, around about 3 lines, maybe 4 lines in your workbook. This will be about a grade 4, as it goes into detail but still does not analyse. This person has not selected an individual word to comment in more detail, they simply explain the quote, the whole quote at once. Our last example then is the best of the 3. The quote, our wedding lying near the television, challenges us to think about traditional wedding vows and love are being discarded, which may suggest the breakdown of society and its values. The word lying implies that the vows are taken or almost forgotten, or may imply the vows are not true in the first place. There is no doubt that example number 3 has a much better understanding of this poem. They've thought about what exactly this line is making us think about, and then they've selected the word lying to look at in detail. That's our analysis here. So the word lying implies, and they've explained why the word lying in particular is used. It's really important when explaining an individual word that you just focus on that one word. Don't start giving a general statement about the whole poem. Focus on exactly why you think that particular word was used. It could easily say, our wedding, not telling the truth, near the television. But this person, Larkin, has particularly chosen the word lying, and we need to think why he did that. You can see now the same answer colour-coded in terms of the skills that's used there. Challenges us, the word lying, which is our analysis section, and implies to us all in blue, linking to the reader, then looking at individual words. The parts that are underlined there are where the person writing has tried to explain why that quote was used, or why they made that statement, which may suggest the breakdown of society and its values, or may even imply to us that the vows were not true in the first place. That's showing they have a deeper understanding of the poem. Remember, we looked at an iceberg in a previous clip, the idea of a poem having a simple meaning and then a much more detailed one. A quote is the same. Most quotes, everyone will be able to say something about it, but it's that deeper meaning that's being hinted at through the word choices and techniques used that really get you the high grades. Let's have a look at this one here then. Something is pushing them into the side of their own lives. I've selected a quote with enjambment here, so it's 2 lines of the poem, and I now need to think, what can I tell from that quote? Which word would I particularly look at in detail to show I can analyse? I could start my answer with this quote shows. I could start with this suggests to us that. Or hopefully I'd want to start with challenges us to think. Please pause the video, think about which one of those options you'd take and think what you would say about it. The size of the box indicates how much you'd want to write. Again, pause the video please, and think about what you'd write for this quote. Here is what I would write. The quote, something is pushing them to the side of their own lives, challenges us to think that the mothers are being manipulated by the lives they live. The vague something suggests to us that Larkin may be implying that it's government or God that's controlling them. The enjambment here suggests their future won't happen or has already lost this unseen force. The part where I've analysed is in green, but the part where I actually look at the structure of the quote is in blue. There is no harm and extra marks, of course, if you look at the punctuation being used or the line splits, the enjambment. Why has the poet cut that line in that particular place? Lastly then, I can compare this poem to the poem Valentine, as they both explore love, but Larkin's poem is a lot more negative. It also explains the effect of time, so a link could be made to Ozymandias. Or another poem that covers the use of everyday life is Cosy Apologia. Thank you very much for listening to this video on Afternoons by Philip Larkin.